Did you know that only about 1% of cold cases are ever solved? Once all the leads are dried up and there's nowhere else to turn, the case becomes cold. Trying to solve a cold case is nearly impossible, let alone one that was 30 years old. In today's true crime story, we're going to be discussing the murder of Jim Clark and how this case went dormant for 30 years and was finally solved. You're not going to believe how it was solved or why the murderer did what he did. My name is Josh and this is Murder Monologue. Let's get started. Joe Clark was a police officer for the Washington County Sheriff's Department in Ohio. It was February 7th, 1981, and Joe and his wife Patricia were having the evening to themselves. They were at home, relaxing, watching a basketball game. Joe took one last swig of his drink in the living room, stood up, asked his wife if she needed anything from the kitchen. She said no, so he headed that way. As Joe is in the kitchen, Patricia's still watching the basketball game in the living room. All of a sudden, she hears glass breaking, so she gets up, goes to the kitchen to find out what happened. As she gets to the kitchen, she sees Joe laying on the floor and a little bit of blood around his head. There is some glass that is smashed on the floor as well. At this point, she thinks that Joe is suffering from a heart attack, so she calls 911 and gets the ambulance there right away. He's not responsive at all, so Patricia starts to panic a little bit. Joe was rushed to the hospital by ambulance and was pronounced dead shortly after arriving. So Joe was a veteran on the police force, and a lot of officers working that night heard the police call come through, and they knew exactly what address it was. So some of the officers started showing up at the hospital to make sure that Joe and his family were okay. As Joe's co-workers arrived at the hospital, they were told that he had a heart attack and he didn't make it. Patricia and the other officers that Joe worked with were all in the waiting room when the doctor came out to talk to them. The doctor took everyone aside and told them all that Joe wasn't actually the victim of a heart attack. He was, however, the victim of a murder. When the doctor was doing an exam of Joe, he found a bullet hole in his head. Joe was shot and killed that night. Patricia and the other officers didn't know what to think. They had no clue what was going on. One of their fellow officers was just shot in the head at his house. So police actually rushed over to Joe's house and set up a crime scene to make sure that nothing was tampered with. This was now an active murder investigation on one of their own. After police and investigators roped off the house with crime scene tape, they decided to go in. After entering the kitchen, they noticed that the plate glass window in there was shattered. They also found shotgun pellets on the floor and buried in the walls. It was quickly determined that the killer was aiming a shotgun through the window as Joe went to refresh his drink. The killer, using a buckshot shotgun, shot through the window, hit Joe in the head, and killed him instantly. Police also started combing the area and asking the neighbors if they saw something. There were 10 witnesses that said that they saw a blue Ford Pinto parked in the area the night of the murder. The witnesses also said that there was someone parked in the car and the car was running the whole time. One witness in particular said they drove past the blue Ford Pinto and noticed that someone was inside in the driver's seat, and when they passed, they stuck their hands up like this in order to cover their face and their identity. After this car drove about a quarter of a mile down the street, they said they heard a shotgun blast or some sort of gunshot off in the distance. Investigators believe that there were two people responsible for this murder because there was no way that that gunshot was heard and someone had enough time to run from Joe's house to the Ford Pinto to be in that driver's seat. So they think there was someone in that Ford Pinto waiting as a getaway driver for the person doing the murdering. The next day at the crime scene, police were able to pull a boot print out of the mud. This boot print was like a military style boot print, so they knew they had something to go on. Not a lot of people wear that type of boot. The other thing they found was a single shotgun shell that had been fired, and that was it. That's all they had to go on. One shotgun shell and one boot print. The homicide investigation was officially handed over to Deputy Taylor. Now, this was a very high-profile case. This county was a pretty low crime rate at the time, and they did not have a lot of murders happen, let alone the murder of a police officer. So this was getting a lot of news attention and considered a high-profile case. Now, Deputy Taylor was a rookie. This was his first homicide investigation, and everyone was questioning why he was put in charge of this. They had other senior investigators that would have gladly taken this on, but they left it with Deputy Taylor for some reason. Now, this rookie investigator had little to nothing to go on and was tasked with solving this high-profile case. Not only was Joe a fellow police officer to Deputy Taylor, he was actually his boss. So this investigator is a brand new rookie, has never been on a murder investigation before, and the very first investigation he gets put on is a fellow officer and his boss. And there is literally no evidence. There's a shotgun shell and a boot print. That's it. Even Deputy Taylor was on record saying he has no clue why he was given this investigation. Either way, he had a job to do. This murder investigation was his, and he was going to do everything he could to get it solved. With all of the witnesses saying that they saw a blue Ford Pinto parked in the area the night of the murder, that was Deputy Taylor's first task. He called the DMV and asked them to pull a record of all of the blue Ford Pintos in the state. The DMV came back with over 4,000 results. This lead was already a bust, and he didn't even get to do anything with it. It was basically a number that was too high to investigate. Deputy Taylor then decided to look back on Joe's past. It was found that 2 days before the murder, Joe actually did a TV interview saying that there was going to be some big news in the coming days. He was going to be cracking down on drugs and had some large announcements that he was going to make. He made a pretty clear indication that he was going to be busting up some drug rings in the area. The day that the news article went to print was the day Joe was murdered. Given all the circumstances and all the coincidences, investigators were now believing that this might be drug related. To add to the coincidences even more, 3 days after Joe was murdered, they were called to another crime scene at a trailer park. Deputy Taylor was the first person to arrive at the trailer park. As he walked into the trailer, he looked down the hallway and saw that there was blood on the floor. That's when Deputy Taylor found a known drug dealer laying on the floor in a pile of blood, shot in the head. He also found a large baggie of drugs on the counter. There are so many coincidences with this incident. The person was shot in the head just like Joe was. It was also the second murder in 3 days that could be drug related. Everyone on the police force, including the investigators, now thought that they were about to have a drug war on their hands. All of these coincidences also gave the police community reason to believe that they were being gunned down by the drug dealers. Everyone was kind of afraid for their life at this point. All of the police officers were kind of on edge at this point, thinking that they were targets. Now Joe was about to be buried with full military honors. And what happens when a police officer is killed? All other police officers show up to pay their respects at the funeral. However, the police officers were afraid that they were being targeted by drug dealers. So, police officers did show up in uniform, but there were also a bunch of other officers that showed up in plain clothes and were undercover at the time of the funeral. The funeral was able to be had without a hitch. Nothing happened, thank God. Immediately after the funeral, Deputy Taylor started digging into the drug community a little more. He talked to dealers, users, informants, anyone that he thought he could get a little information out of, he talked to. As soon as he started questioning the drug community, he started getting death threats. He was told that if he kept digging, he would be dead like the other officer was. Again, this is just adding to the scope of the investigation, with the investigators believing that this had to be drug related. They're getting a little tunnel vision at this point because it just makes sense. Why would the drug community be threatening other officers if they had nothing to do with it? Deputy Taylor was legitimately afraid for his life. So much so that he actually moved his family out of the county. He then spent most of his nights sleeping at the sheriff's office in a holding cell. In that holding cell, he had his gun ready and a shotgun in the corner just in case someone wanted to break in and try to kill him. Every single day, someone from the drug community would threaten to kill him. This was making his job even more difficult. However, as difficult as his job may have been, it didn't stop Deputy Taylor from trying to solve his boss's murder. He had an informant contact him and tell him that they knew what had happened in the trailer park. This was the first legitimate lead that they had. The informant said that there was a black guy named Washington and a white guy named Jones that broke into that trailer and killed the person. Again, adding to the coincidences that this had to be drug related. There were two people that were related to drugs that broke into a trailer of a drug dealer and killed someone. Now, if you remember back with Officer Joe Clark, they were saying there had to be two people as well because there was someone parked in the car and someone doing the shooting. So again, all of these coincidences are just giving them even more reason to believe this was drug related. And this is just building up the tunnel vision that they have. Now, Deputy Taylor was pretty confident that he was chasing the same two people that murdered someone in the trailer park and murdered Joe Clark. The two suspects, Washington and Jones, were actually from a different county. So Deputy Taylor called the county, and the person he talked to kind of chuckled and said, "Hey, yeah, we actually have them in jail right now. You can come talk to them." He immediately drove to the jailhouse and started questioning the suspects. Washington and Jones immediately confessed to the murder. They said that it was just supposed to be a simple drug deal, and that after the drug deal happened, they were going to rob him and take the money back. So essentially, it was a little con game that they were playing. However, this person put up a fight, so they ended up pulling out a gun and shooting him. They also said that someone named Matt Bonner set up this whole deal and told them to rob him. Now, Matt Bonner was probably the most well-known drug dealer in the area. He was basically the drug kingpin in the whole county. And another coincidence was Joe Clark was investigating Matt Bonner for the last year on drug-related charges. Now, Deputy Taylor asked Mr. Washington and Mr. Jones if they had killed Joe Clark as well. They said, "No, absolutely not, but go check with Matt Bonner." So now Deputy Taylor thinks that he's getting close to solving Joe Clark's murder. He just solved the murder in the trailer park and was just given a name of a person that could be connected to Joe Clark's murder. They were able to locate Matt Bonner and decided to interrogate him at the police station. They interrogated him for over 4 hours, and Matt Bonner was sticking to his story. He knew nothing about Joe Clark's murder and had absolutely nothing to do with the murder at the trailer park, with nothing to tie him to either of the murders outside of one person saying that, yeah, he was connected to it. They had to let him go. They had no evidence whatsoever. All of the leads had gone dry. That was the last lead that they were able to get. Now, the only thing that they had going for them was the over 4,000 blue Ford Pintos that were registered in the state. How are they ever going to comb through 4,000 vehicles and contact every single person? The answer is they don't. They're not going to. Therefore, this case is now cold. They did get one last lead that trickled in. Someone at a bar overheard a person by the name of Jimmy Kiston talking about how they put a hole in Joe Clark's head. Jimmy Kiston was also very well known in the police community. He was an alcoholic, he was abusive, he was known by name by all the cops. He was what you call a frequent flyer. So Jimmy was found at a local tavern and was brought down to the police station for questioning. Now, Jimmy at the time was very inebriated. He was asked to give details about the murder. He was not able to come up with anything. He had no details whatsoever, and it just wasn't making sense. So they found out that Jimmy was basically just saying all of this to get a rouse out of everyone, and he had absolutely nothing to do with Joe Clark's murder. He just liked to run his mouth when he got drunk. So that was the last lead. And this case is now cold and will be cold for the next 30 years. Also, that was the last lead that Deputy Taylor pursued, as he was getting so many death threats at this time that he decided to quit. He was no longer with the police force in Washington County. After 31 years of this being a cold case, Washington County is now opening a cold case unit. Larry Minks was the Washington County Sheriff. He decided that he wanted to ask a few of his lead investigators if they had any interest in opening up a cold case unit. Jerry Severs was the first person on the docket. He accepted to lead the cold case unit, and the first one he wanted to investigate was the murder of his fellow police officer, Joe Clark. Now, after 31 years, they knew going into this that they had a very slim chance of ever solving this murder case. Again, about 1% of all cold cases actually get solved. The case file was nearing 20,000 pages. So Jerry Severs and his cold case unit had to comb through over 20,000 pages of information to get acquainted with this case. They immediately pulled the shotgun shell casing and tested it for fingerprint DNA. This type of testing can literally pull DNA from a fingerprint, like the oils and everything that you leave as a fingerprint. This type of technology can pull your DNA from that. Isn't that crazy? So that was the very first thing that they wanted to do. If they could use advanced technology to pull a fingerprint DNA off the shotgun shell case and it came back as a match in their system, like, case closed, you're done, you can go home. This 30-year-old case was just solved in like, I don't know, a week. However, it's not that easy. It came back as a negative result. They didn't have any fingerprint DNA. Of course they couldn't. Like, this wouldn't be a story. I wouldn't be talking about it. So no, it came back as nothing. So that sucks. This was the evidence that they were hoping would hit. And when it didn't, everyone had to take a deep breath and say, all right, let's get to work. This is going to be a good old-fashioned investigation. One of the luckier parts of this investigation was the house that Joe Clark was murdered in has now gone through several different owners, but the layout hasn't changed at all. So investigators were able to take their 3D scanner and actually put it in Joe's house and do a whole 3D rendering of the house and the kitchen area that he was murdered in. This basically brought the whole crime scene back to life for the new investigators. The second piece to this puzzle was the investigators wanted to find out if they could narrow down what type of shotgun was used for this murder. So they focused a lot of their attention on the window that was shot through and all of the bullet holes in the ceiling and the walls. So if you're not sure what buckshot is, it's basically a shotgun shell that has several like pellets in it, almost like BB pellets. And when it's shot, these pellets shoot out of the shell and they kind of expand as they're traveling. So what happens is the further out you are, the wider your spread is going to be. The closer you are, the closer your spread. Also, the barrel length will matter. If you have a longer barrel, it's going to keep those pellets bunched up closer because they have a longer way to travel through the barrel before they start to spread out. And the same thing with a shorter barrel. The shorter amount of time they're in the barrel, the larger the spread is going to be once they leave the barrel. So just based on where the bullet holes were in the house and how far out that spread was, they can determine a lot from that. And that's the type of testing they wanted to do. So the investigators decided to test different barrel lengths, standing at various distances apart from a target. After they would shoot their buckshot, they would measure the spread of all of the mini BBs inside. After doing all this testing and measuring all the spreads, they found that an 18-inch barrel matched almost exactly with the spread that was through the house. This 18-inch barrel was shot from within 31 feet of the window. That's how accurate they were able to be with this. Now, why this discovery was so crucial to the investigation is because standard shotgun barrels are about 20 inches long. Military and police officers actually use 18-inch barrels. So with this matching an 18-inch barrel, they were actually able to say, well, holy crap, this might have been some ex-military or ex-police officer that did this killing. How else would they get their hands on an 18-inch barrel? They're really not that common. Like, you can go buy 18-inch barrels, but it's really not that common. Most people aren't changing out their barrels. So this information helped the cold case investigators develop a new profile for this person. They now believe that they were after someone that had a grudge against Joe. They also think the suspect had close ties with military or was even in the police force for a while, due to the size of the barrel. They now started combing through Joe Clark's old police records, like anyone that he had pulled over, anyone that he has had contact with, who could be holding a grudge against Joe that they didn't necessarily look for in the first investigation 30 years ago. What they came across was a name of Matt Bonner. Now, if you remember, 30 years ago, Matt Bonner was also a main suspect in this investigation. However, they didn't have enough evidence to pin him with anything. He was apparently the mastermind behind the trailer park murder, and they had good reason to believe that Matt Bonner might be involved with this one. However, it was basically his word against everyone else's. They didn't have anything to go on, so they had to let him go. What they didn't realize 30 years ago was Matt Bonner was actually arrested about 2 weeks prior to Joe Clark being murdered. He was arrested for breaking and entering. As Matt Bonner was put in handcuffs for breaking and entering, he was put into the back of a squad car. The police officer driving that squad car drove Matt Bonner down to a creek bed because Matt kept saying he had nothing to do with the break-in. The officer then took Matt Bonner out of the squad car and beat the crap out of him until he finally confessed to breaking and entering. This police officer went as far as to put his gun to Matt's head. He then threatened him and said, "If you don't confess to this, I'm gonna blow your brains out." So obviously Matt Bonner is still being handcuffed and this officer is just wailing on him, then points his gun at his head. Yeah, Matt Bonner was like, "Okay, I will take the charge for breaking and entering. Please don't shoot me." So he confessed. However, he also filed a complaint with the sheriff's department. Obviously, the investigator assigned to look at this case was none other than Joe Clark. After conducting the investigation, Joe Clark made the determination that the police officer should be fired for his conduct. And he was. Officer Mitch Rubel was fired immediately. Now, Mitch Rubel was the perfect fit for the profile that these investigators came up with. He had a military background serving in Vietnam. He also served as a police officer, obviously. He was a gun fanatic. I mean, he had a ton of guns. It was also found that Mitch Rubel was urging the police department to switch to buckshot at the time of this occurrence. And just to put some icing on this cake, he drove a blue Ford Pinto. Mitch Rubel now became the main suspect for the murder of Joe Clark. Now, let's take this back about 30 years. In 1981, Mitch Rubel was having an affair with his wife, with a woman named Mac. The weekend of the murder, Mitch made plans to stay in a hotel room with Mac. At this point in time, Mitch had just been fired from the police force, and he was pissed. Nothing was his fault, according to him. He was basically being set up for this whole thing and should never have been fired, according to Mitch. So as Mitch Rubel got to the hotel room to visit his mistress, Mac, Mac basically said, "Hey, I just saw Joe Clark on the TV. He was at some community event. He seemed really nice." And Mitch lost it. He was like, "This guy is not nice. He is such a prick. He got me fired. Nothing is my fault. This guy had it in for me." Everything under the sun. He became so angry that he started to abuse Mac. He was basically using her like a punching bag to get all of his anger and frustration out. According to Mac, it was at this time that Mitch decided that he needed revenge on the whole situation. She remembered Mitch making statements like Joe needs to be 6 feet under. He then got into his blue Ford Pinto and drove away. After talking with Mac, this gave the investigators enough information that they now wanted to go talk to Mitch. Mitch, of course, gave the police officers an alibi for the night that Joe Clark was murdered. He said that he was hanging out with a guy named Todd Smith all night. That was literally all they got out of the questioning. Mitch was shut down, and all he said was, "I was hanging out with Todd Smith." That's it. So of course, investigators went on a search to find Todd Smith. Once they were able to locate him, Todd did say that he hung out with Mitch that night, and they didn't go anywhere. They interviewed Todd Smith for 4 hours and could kind of see that he was a little uncomfortable during the interview. It was almost like he was scared of something. It wasn't until that they offered him police protection that he finally broke down and told the real story. The story Todd told went like this. There was a knock at his apartment the night of the murder. When he opened the door, Mitch was standing there and greeted him. Mitch looked agitated and asked if Todd had any shotguns in his apartment. Todd kind of chuckled and said, "Well, he knew I had a shotgun because Mitch actually gave him a shotgun about a week or two prior to that." So Todd gave Mitch the shotgun and they both left in the blue Ford Pinto. As they were driving, Mitch said, "Let's go kill us a lieutenant tonight." Todd laughed the comment off, thinking Mitch was just kind of joking around. However, it wasn't until they pulled up in front of his house that things got a little more serious. As they parked the car, Mitch got out and said, "Don't move, I'll be right back." Todd said that he waited there for so long in the car that he was starting to get scared. There was a lot of traffic going past and he tried to hide his face from everyone because he knew that they were probably going to be getting into trouble. After waiting for what seemed like an hour, Todd decided to drive off without Mitch and head back to his apartment. A short while later, Mitch showed back up at Todd's apartment and was very angry. Mitch pulled out a hunting knife, held it to Todd's ribs, and said, "If you ever tell anyone what happened tonight, I'll kill you." This interrogation now gave investigators enough information for them to believe that Mitch Rubel was the killer. However, they wanted to gather even more evidence if they could. They really wanted to get their hands on that shotgun. Todd said he thought one of Mitch's military buddies owned the shotgun. So the police actually came up with a pretty brilliant plan. They decided that they were gonna wait for one of Mitch's reunions to happen, which is only a few weeks away. During that reunion, all of his military buddies got together. The investigators were camped out in a van that had high surveillance technology in it. They were actually able to use facial recognition at this military reunion to get an identification of everyone that went there. After they got everyone's identification, they took it back to the police station and started calling everyone. They asked every single person if they had ever purchased a shotgun from Mitch Rubel. Every single lead turned up blank. They were on their very last person to call. This was the only person that said they had purchased a gun. And it was a shotgun with an 18-inch barrel. So investigators then went and collected the shotgun and did a little testing on it. And they found out that it was a perfect match for the spread that was throughout the house. They now had everything they needed to lock Mitch Rubel up. Now they knew Mitch had the potential to be a very dangerous person with his military background, and they knew that he collected weapons. So as luck would have it, Mitch and his wife were recent victims of identity theft. So the investigators actually called Mitch and were like, "Hey, can you stop down at the police station because we actually have an update for you on this identity theft thing." So Mitch, thinking everything was good, he decided, yeah, I'll stop down at the police station. As soon as Mitch entered the police station, he got handcuffed and swiftly taken away. At the same time that Mitch left his house to go to the police station, there was a special unit that executed a search on his house. What they found in the house was mind-blowing. They found explosives, thousands and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Mitch basically had a whole armory in his house. There were fuses for grenades. There were grenades that were half put together. There were so many explosives that the bomb squad had to take them out to an empty field and detonate them because they were so unstable. They believe after learning all of this information and finding all of this ammunition in his house that Mitch would have barricaded himself in the house and basically fought to the death with the police. And he probably had enough ammunition there to last for several weeks. Fortunately, Mitch is a little gullible, so he went to the police station and got arrested without incident. He was officially charged and found guilty of first-degree murder in 2016, but this was not until he went through one hung jury and a bunch of appeals. Unfortunately, he was sentenced to life in prison and ended up dying in 2017, so he literally only spent 1 year in prison. But at least there's closure for Joe Clark. This cold case was finally solved after 31 years and some great investigative techniques. That is the story of Joe Clark, the 30-year-old cold case that was finally solved. If you like this, or if you like my other content, please do me a favor and subscribe to my page. Thanks, everybody.